So I am delighted to have April Rinne with us today. So April is founder and principal of April Worldwide. I suppose April, well, we know each other for quite a few years. You've helped us out at Trōv quite a lot, and um, I'm not even. This is going to be different than the conversations we've had before. We've interviewed folks in our industry, but I think this is going to be really interesting because we're almost flipping it around, as you and I were talking about beforehand. You have a much bigger perspective than just our industry. So I'm not going to try and frame you. I think it's best to hear from you who you are, how you got here, and what you do, I suppose, for a living.
Mm, Thank you, Ian, and just thank you for this opportunity. It's really good to reconnect and also to connect back with the Trove community because you're right. I am not an industry expert. I have not spent my career in insurance or even in technology, yet both of those things are germane to the things that I do. So it's funny, these days, a lot of people will call me a futurist. A lot of people will call me effectively a bumblebee, where they're like, you're just cross-pollinating ideas and connections and insights from culture to culture, from country to country, from sector to sector. So that's where I'll come back in a minute. But if we back up, not all the way to childhood, so to speak, but I did know from a very young age that I wanted to have an international career. I was just interested in how do people live and what makes people tick and how are people different from one another. And I think a lot of that goes back to my upbringing, where my dad was a cultural geographer, meaning that he studied the migratory patterns of people and plants and animals, and he was a teacher. So it was always about education and travel. And he would tell me growing up, I think it is actually quite relevant to today's times. I was told as a kid a few different things. One, diversity is our strength. Go out there and explore the world. Like we're not gonna fund your way to do that, but like we'll never get in your way. And he would say things like, the more different someone looks from you, the more interesting they are to get to know. Sort of like, why would you want to get to know? Why would you want to look like you and eat like you? Like, why? What's interesting about that? With all due respect to all people, that sense of learn from people who are very different than you. And also a huge emphasis, as I mentioned, on education and travel. And so the other piece was that when it came to my career and what I did, they made it very clear that my career was never to be about me. It was about being of service to others. That because I'd been lucky to get an education, which a lot of kids in the world do not have that fortune, I had a duty, a responsibility to give back. And so, they were like, you can serve in many ways. You can be a teacher or a doctor or an environmentalist, but never think it's about you. So I share this because those values, today I've really come to realize how important those early learnings were. So I was always just interested in everything, but primarily global and primarily what are the overlaps between how people live, where how do business and policy intersect, how do travel and sustainability intersect, et cetera, et cetera. And so I ended up, not surprisingly, triple majoring as an undergrad, doing a joint degree as in graduate school, because I was interested in not just one thing, but how these things connected. And so I did law and finance in terms of grad school. And I really focused on global development, economic development. It might be worth or interesting to mention, people often like this, in between college and grad school, I actually spent almost 4 years without a permanent address. And half the year I researched and guided hiking and biking trips in Italy and in Patagonia and Morocco and Vietnam, all over the place. And then the other half of the year I traveled. And so I earned just enough income to pay for the travels, but basically my sole overarching goal was to see how as much of the rest of the world lived as I could, so that I could better understand how to be of service. And that's when I really started to piece together issues of global development, economic inclusion, urban planning. We'll talk about that a little bit today. Urbanization. I've lived in urban slums in megacities in the developing world. I've worked on water and sanitation infrastructure. I've worked on microfinance, which is small loans to the economically active poor. And of course, role of technology in all of this, which helps leapfrog some of these inefficiencies and distortions. So that's kind of my background, like super, super global, super, super interdisciplinary. And for the last 7 years, thereabouts, I've been independent, really doing much of what I've just described in an advisory capacity, but primarily working with startups on the one hand and policymakers, governments, whether that's city governments, state, national, regional, depending on where it is that I'm working. But I work in about, until this year, until COVID hit, I work in about 20 different countries a year. I travel a lot, and I'm doing a lot of that sort of who needs to be around the table to make sure that we're building business in the most responsible, wise, sustainable way, and that we're crafting policies in the most inclusive, again, responsible way, given that we have a lot of things broken in the world today. And also we know that there's not a clear roadmap for what the future looks like. So building that business and designing those policies, this is really hard work. No one has figured it out for sure. But what I continue to realize and continue to share with others is that there's so much we can learn from places beyond our own backyard, beyond our own community, beyond our own country, that they don't make the headlines globally. So we just don't know that they're there, but they're actually hugely helpful. And whether that's what the insurance industry can learn from wildly different sectors, or what a country like the United States can learn from a tiny country like Estonia, which maybe we can talk about later. But I mean, Estonia, it's a fascinating place with insights for the world. And that's just one example. So let me pause there, because that's a little bit about me. And I think
I can add a little bit of color in terms of Trov's experience and interaction with you, and mine particularly. So you and I probably have been having conversations for nearly 4 years now. And so the value that you bring, apart from being a fun person to interact with and having good energy, is particularly in Trōv mobility, right? We're playing in this space that is constantly evolving. It's something, it's old, but it's new, and it changes, and the shape of it changes in different ways over time and in different places in time. And so it's easy for us, let me put it the other way, it's hard for us to lift our heads up from the pages and try and look over the horizon a little bit. And so you're able to tie those threads together for us in ways that we wouldn't be able to do, because you have this broader perspective. And that's often, right, the way to get step function improvements and things, where you sort of synthesize various different things together. So so I think of you a little bit like a futurist. So maybe that's too narrowing, but that's the value, I suppose, that you bring to us.
Yeah, and a little more context on Trōv. And it is fun because I'm often called a futurist these days. Now, I love that. It's not that I wouldn't call myself that. It's that people typically look at me and they say, oh, you were a lawyer, you're an investor, you're a strategist, you're an advisor. And then, futurist is sort of this like, what's that? But it's very much helping people see what's on the horizon and design different, the future can't be controlled. It can't really be predicted, but we can prepare. So what are the different scenarios we need to prepare for the future? And my initial connection to Trōv, it's interesting. It's when one of the few core themes that I've been focusing on over the last 7 years has been this concept of sharing economy, the collaborative economy, business models focused on access over ownership. And again, I was really interested in that because of its role for building responsible business and building better policies. When we think about the benefits of access over ownership, I have to put a caveat: when done right? A lot of this, again, goes to mindsets and intentions. But when you share rather than own assets, you can save money. It's better for the environment. You can build community. It's more convenient. It has all these benefits. But again, there's not really a roadmap for what it looks like to build that kind of ecosystem. And so that's how, when Trōv was looking at shared use mobility, whether that's car sharing, bike sharing, now obviously e-scooter sharing, etc., that we connected because we had that point of common connection. But then there have been different layers that you mentioned that we've added on over time. So it's been really rewarding. And for me, it's been a wonderful way to get involved and add value to the insurance sector, the insurance industry, without being, you know, a self-professed insurance expert. Yeah.
So let's start tapping into your expertise here a little bit. So we are, for those looking back at this, late June 2020. I was going to say we're in the middle of the pandemic, the end. I don't know where we are, but we're in the pandemic, and you can decide, you know, yourselves sort of where we are in that trajectory. But I think you're uniquely positioned to help us sort of navigate what's coming in front of us, or even that perhaps is even too specific, even think about what might be in front of us. And so many of us have talked about the new normal. And so some of that is, you know, you're traveling all over the world, or you used to be, you were up until a couple of months ago, you're in the same place. You and I are chatting over Zoom. We're dealing with, you know, people in the house. We're dealing with Zoom, which was just experienced not working particularly well. So there's all this new normal. Is this here to stay? How do we even, is new normal the right thing to say? Like, what do you think about this? Your job has been to constantly look in the future, so you're probably better placed than any of us to sort of think about this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I enthusiastically agree in terms of change being our new normal, whatever we want to call it. I actually often use the phrase the new, now, never normal, because
Okay.
we can talk about a new normal, but I'm not sure what that is. I genuinely am not sure what new normal is, other than a lot of change. The now normal, which actually indicates just like whatever's happening right now, and we can talk more about what that means with regards to just being present in the here and now, and how we spend the vast majority of our time, our mental energy, living in the past or anticipating the future. But we actually don't spend that much time in the here and now. I think COVID has actually been a huge wake-up call for how much time we do spend living and strategizing and, you know, reminiscing about the past, or regretting the past, or whatever it may be, and then trying to predict or control the future. And so it's interesting. So that's sort of the now normal of like, what is happening now, being present, or the never normal, which is, you know, and then there are people out there who are using all of these, right? The never normal, which is, yeah, there is no such thing as normal. And I think there's a grain of truth in all three of those. So I sort of lump them together and say, yes, there is definitely a new normal, but the normal I'm looking at looking forward, the new normal doesn't look like it looks today, and it also doesn't look like it looked 6 months ago. So to your point, one of the things that I think a lot of us, well, we might sense, but I think we're just starting to get our heads around the fact as we come out of lockdown and so forth, we are really, really early into the overall effects and implications of COVID and the ripple effects, not just for public health, but, you know, we haven't had a pandemic like this since 1918, and we haven't had financial volatility like this since the early 1930s, and we haven't had social unrest like this since 1968. That is all happening at the same time. Like, that is just this maelstrom of uncertainty, complexity. It's interesting, lots of conversations about the VUCA world, if you're familiar with VUCA, which is, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. VUCA is a super interesting concept to look at, but even what we're going through now, we're sort of blowing the lid off of some of what VUCA can address. So one of my favorite sayings, which I always find just sobering as well as just kind of awe-inspiring, is that pace of change has never been as fast as it is today, and yet it's unlikely to ever again be this slow. And if you just pause and let that sink in, you kind of go,
scary, by the way.
Whoa, it's scary. So this is something, not to foreshadow too much, but I'm in the process of writing my first book, which grows out of this acknowledgement. And I think we can maybe circle back to it. But the point I want to underscore is that change is here to stay. We can ask questions around of change. I think in particular, the mindsets, the tools, the skills, the disciplines we use to navigate change, those are due for just a massive upgrade. Traditional change management, if you talk to a lot of strategists out there, traditional change management is dead. This isn't the world that we can predict, command, control. This is a whole new, much more messy landscape that we get to navigate. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't. It doesn't mean that we can't figure this out. I mean, the history of humanity is innovation and adaptation and resilience and so forth. That's how we're here today. So there's plenty of reason to be optimistic about the ways in which we navigate our way forward. But this notion of that somehow we're going to go back to how it was, or somehow that change itself is going to stop, or at some point we'll return to a slower pace of change, I don't see any way in which that's going to happen. I wanted to add just a brief footnote to that, which is, back on the pace of change, and it's never been this fast, it'll likely never again be this slow. So play that out a little bit with me, whether that's you individually in your career and with your family, or whether that is the organization lead, or whether that is society as a whole, as we look at systems changing and climate and, lots of different borderless issues. So if that's the case, and then think about what society typically tells us to do when the pace of change increases. They typically tell us to run faster. They're like, you just need to keep up. You just need to cope, right? There's not a kind of acknowledgement that the human body, the humanity might not be designed to run ever faster. It looks, at best that looks like burnout. At worst, that looks like potentially systemic collapse. So again, that's not intended to be like doomsday. We're looking at a kind of wake-up call and a reckoning that running ever faster, if you look at any system that had to run ever faster, it will collapse. So what we're looking at is, okay, we all need to actually catch our breath and figuratively hit the pause button. Yep. And I think, lockdown and COVID has been an incredible catalyst and accelerant to do just that. When things start to be, as things begin to reopen, like what parts of normal do you actually want to go back to? There's a whole lot that I don't think a lot of people want to go back to. And we're being given this opportunity, again, to design differently, but it requires a lot of focus on our mindsets, assumptions, expectations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's been, just to speak maybe personally, but maybe this will resonate, it's been a really interesting, the early phases of this were fascinating. We were all told to stay in our houses, right? We were forced to stay in our houses. And where I lived, that meant a lot of people doing yard work because they were forced to look at their yard and go, oh my God, I need to do something with that, right? And so on the one hand, and that was nice too, because you get that was a slowing down. And that was, to illustrate that a little bit, like you're in my yard, we're pulling weeds out and you see progress. And it's a very linear thing. And most of our lives are non-linear in the sense of you put effort in and something you hope happens later on. So on the one hand, we had to slow right down. On the other hand, our brains were going into fast forward saying, oh my God, what is happening? What's going on here? How do I get onto this meeting? What are we going to do summer for the kids? What's happening with the business? So fast forward to where we are now, and I'm speaking about myself, 2 or 3 months into it now. The cognitive processing is more of it's done now. We have a routine, get up in the morning. I know where I work in the backyard a lot more. I put a table out there. I work at my desk as well. So that bit, I kind of have I have a new normal in that regard. What we're seeing on the business side, on the Trōv mobility side, is the business is coming back. So shared use mobility, we're seeing some of our customers have had their biggest months ever, right? Ever, not just, they're back to where they were. They're bigger than they ever were before, which is amazing. And it speaks a little bit to what you were talking about, which is we've had a little bit of a reset. Okay, what's important? What do I want to do? What are the things I actually want to do more of? And so we're seeing in the shared mobility space, we're seeing the overall demand hasn't really declined. It's shifted. You can imagine public transport, which we're not heavily involved in, but I think intuitively we all know that's had a little bit of a dip, but we're seeing that mobility, people still need to move around, show up in different places. So back to you then, what else is like, that's maybe one dimension of change that's I'm conscious of, but maybe travel is another one, right? You and I travel an enormous amount for work. I haven't traveled. In fact, I looked at my Google Maps history for the last couple of months, and it's just gone from a radius of about 10,000 miles down to its lowest was 2 miles, right? And so what else, help us here, chart a course for us a little bit. What else are the sort of the changes that you foresee for us in the near future?
Yeah, so let me pick up on a couple things that you just mentioned, because I think to really underscore, like, this is a unique moment in time, and we need to spend more time, not in like a navel gazing way, but like reflecting on what this moment is to teach us. And I think about my own experience, but also talking and looking, this is what I do, like wrapping our heads around, for all of us on the whole, what are we looking at? Something as simple as more people have watched the seasons change than ever. Like, you actually, when you're home, you notice small changes every day.
Mm-hmm.
Lockdown coincided with, in the US, the arrival of spring. How often, and you're in your garden every day, like, really, if you think back, did you ever really see spring happen to the degree? Did you ever really think about the different ways in which human connection plays out, like in terms of, we just assume that relationships will always be there, that we'll be able to visit somebody, that we'll be able to spend time. And obviously a lot of that went online, but I think it speaks not just to travel and tourism and mobility, but the human nature of us. One thing I think that is very clear is that lockdown and COVID as a whole has shown us is that we are hardwired for human connection. Mm-hmm. And we can come up with lots of ways, lots of proxies. But, when I hear that demand is coming back, I'm excited. I'm not surprised. But there's this sense of we are designed to move. Now, moving forward, we're going to move differently. We'll get to that. But, lockdown was really an artificial clampdown, right? No one was ready for that, and we needed to do it for public health reasons. Okay. Now there's still certainly public health concerns, and we can talk about that, because again, we're not anywhere close to having our arms around what the coming years look like in terms of how the pandemic could continue to play out. But when we can move to be with other people, we will do that. And mm-hmm. It's the, absence makes the heart grow fonder, whatever anecdote we want to put on that. I think we've seen that in droves. And that to me is really encouraging, because 6 months ago, prior to COVID, and again, this is not a holy grail or a silver bullet or, one size fits all, but we were spending so much time in and on and around our screens, taking so much for granted of how we could live our lives. And I do think there are very real concerns about our relationship with technology as a result of COVID, where some of this has been amped up. But mm-hmm. What we've done is actually highlighted the importance of the argument we need to have around the relationship between humans and technology. And mm-hmm. I get that in and of itself, it's kind of abstract, and like, where does that go? Obviously, it bleeds into learning from home, the future of education, whether that's elementary education, whether that's higher education, whether that's vocational education, right? It bleeds into the future of work. What will our offices look like? Will people return to the office? How will we work together? And certain parts of work from home or work from anywhere are really easy. Certain other parts are really, really hard. And why people feel a connection to their job rarely has to do with connecting virtually with others. Mm-hmm. How do you innovate at scale with technology? That's really hard. Like, mm-hmm. we're coming up with some hacks. But, so this relationship of humans and technology, education, work, obviously mobility, obviously cities, travel and tourism, like, you can sort of take this lens and apply it. What's amazing for me, given what I do, is that the last 6 months have given us the richest petri dish you could ever imagine for having a new lens through which to place it or superimpose it, so to speak, on any given sector, on any
Yeah.
demographic, on
Yeah.
any country. And so it's sort of like, adventure and let's go.
Well,
So
and
I
it's
think there
been,
are lots of directions we can head there, but
yeah. So it's been there's sort of a dichotomy. On the one hand, we've had to lean into technology more. Right? You and I are having conversation over Zoom right now. My mother now knows how to use Zoom, right? And we had we had a talent show at the weekend. My family is not particularly talented when it comes to creativity, but we forced ourselves to do it, right? So, but it's allowed us to socialize. My family is spread all over North America and Europe. So it's allowed us to connect, which has been really wonderful. I have kids who are learning, online. But on the other end of the spectrum, as you know, I've already sort of mentioned, out in the yard, walking the streets, and I live in Oakland, California. I've mentioned this a couple of times before. The the back to basics sort of element, the dichotomy part of it, is one hand leaning in technology, what the other hand leaning away from technology, in a sense, as the streets have been. I think the program is called Safe Streets. So they shut down a bunch of streets to allow people to walk around and to cycle. So that petri dish that you're talking about, I'm interested in sort of riffing on that a little bit more around public policy and how we as individuals, I think, are adjusting fairly quickly. Traditionally, public policy is slow to move, but we're seeing examples of it moving quite quickly. I'm interested to see, to get your perspective on whether that's sort of really just scratching the surface and nothing fundamental is going to change. Is it specific to individual geographies? But what's your sort of your view on that?
yeah. So let me zoom out briefly related to some of what you were talking about earlier in what you just said, and then we're going to bring it back to public policy and cities and mobility. But one of the frames that I really like to place a lot of this in is this concept of, okay, innovation. Innovation, which everyone really likes to talk about, innovation, and that can be business model innovation, that can be public policy innovation, which is exactly what we're seeing when they're opening up streets and so forth. It can be social and cultural innovation, right? Innovation can mean lots of different things, but it's not inherently good or bad, right? The definition of innovation simply means something new, right? Now, so one of my favorite, examples that I'll often use, nuclear fusion, highly innovative. It can make clean energy, it can make bombs, right? A knife is highly innovative. It can carve and cut and design and create, and it can kill someone. Social media, right? Highly innovative. It can connect us, and I think this is the role of technology. It can connect us, and it can divide us. Oops, I hit my water glass. And it can divide us, right? So these are all innovations. How do we make sure that the arc, tends towards better business, better policies, better innovation, better, that we end up on the right side of history, so to speak. And it's interesting because so much of what we're talking about, at the end of the day, whether an innovation is helpful or harmful depends largely on the intention of the user. Now, and I love the example of your family's talent show. Fabulous. That is technological innovation, and also your family was quite innovative. It was creative, right? And coming up with this thing. That is the best kind of intention you could ask for. We're also seeing with technology, and we can get into AI and machine learning and all sorts of things, you can see where a piece of technology could play out very differently depending on the intention of the user around security, privacy, tolerance or intolerance, etc. So I want to bring that as sort of context, because I think it's really easy to forget that we use innovation as though it's somehow inherently good. And I'm a huge proponent of innovation. It's a lot of the work that I do, but we've got to be careful when we talk about some of this terminology. So fast forward to some of the stuff that we're seeing in cities, and it's fun because that's urban innovation, it's policy innovation, it's public health related innovation, it's also community-led innovation, right? So all these different things sort of intersect. Now, keep in mind that in terms of policy, and this is a lot of work that I've done in the sharing economy and around the future of work and lots of stuff pre-COVID, where policy is invariably, almost inevitably, a lagging indicator. Policy changes when it's so clear that society has moved forward that we can't not update our rules, right? Now, that means that you're typically updating policy long after it's time to. And we've seen that, I think, recently also around social and cultural issues and so forth. But policymakers are almost always in a situation of having to play catch up. What's interesting about COVID is that this happened and it whacked everybody pretty much at the same velocity and the same intensity. And it was almost as though policymakers had less to catch up, because if you think about, I always say that the gap between technology and policy is actually wide and usually widening on a daily basis in terms of where technology is versus where policy is. And in this case, sorry, I'm gonna move my water glass. In this case, everybody got hit at the same time. And so it's almost as though policymakers and the private sector and communities are innovating not in equal time, but very much on a similar wavelength and time length. And like, business doesn't have some kind of insight about how the pandemic's going to play out that policy doesn't have. What you have are institutional differences in terms of, like, governments generally work slower, and governments still went to the office even when companies were working more from home, or so you have those kinds of differences. But I think that to me is really exciting, because it's almost this mini level set in which policymakers are immediately part of at the table, immediately playing a more proactive role. Now, briefly, in terms of what we're seeing, I was to remind people, like, cities, urbanization is one of the overarching defining themes of the 21st century. A little bit, if this is interesting, some stats that are fascinating, but 2008 was the first time in human history ever that we had more people outside them. Up until then, it had always been more people living in rural areas than urban.
April, you just broke up for a sec. Would you give us that stat one more time?
Sure. So for the first time in human history, in 2008, more people lived in cities than outside them. So the needle tipped. Up until that point, throughout human history, more people had lived in rural areas or non-urban areas than in cities. And then the needle tilted. So, and we had a global population in 2008 of about 7 billion people, 50% in cities, 50% outside. Today, we have almost 8 billion people, and somewhere between 55 and 60% live in cities. Now, I can fast forward, and again, this assumes that there aren't major catastrophes, which, as we know, could happen. But if you fast forward, by 2050, we're expected to have almost 10 billion people, 75 to 80% of whom live in cities. So if you run the numbers, within 30 years, in 2050, we'll have more people in cities than inhabit the entire planet today. Another fascinating fact, of those 2 billion people that are expected to join us, 60% of them are in Africa, 30% are in Asia, and 10% are scattered amongst the rest of the world. So that's the Americas, Europe, Australia, etc. Now, that stat about population is a little less, it's interesting, but it's, I think, slightly less relevant for today's conversation. What we need to keep in mind is that there are certain universalities or universal goals of cities. But right now, in the here and now, in the shouldn't say post-COVID yet, but in this immediate post-crisis, as we're starting to reemerge, cities have, by and large, similar goals, but the needs and the resources and the wherewithal of mega cities with 20 million people plus kind of thing, is quite different than a city of 100,000 people. And so on the one hand, what we do see, cities of all sizes are focusing more on human-powered and micro-mobility. So we're seeing an emphasis on the walkability, the bicycles, the e-scooters, etc. When you start getting into megacities, they have sort of an additional layer where they're looking also at what is the role of public transport, large public transport budgets that a city of 50 or 100,000 isn't likely to happen, or isn't likely to have. Cars obviously fall in the middle of that spectrum. But it's interesting because we're so early into this, what I'm seeing globally is cities are saying largely the same things around their policy goals moving forward, and specifically around mobility. Their goals, their stated goals are very much aligned. What we haven't yet lived long enough to see or experience is, what does it look like to implement those plans? How do you translate those into actions? We have seen small things like more bike lanes opening up. We've seen streets opening up that used to be for traffic. Now they're going to be for restaurants, at least over the course of the summer, so that people can go outside. We've seen some subsidies, etc. But we haven't necessarily seen a new system redesign take place, and that's going to take some years. So, words versus action, there are lots of things that are very similar amongst cities, and lots of things where we still have hanging question marks.
So there's another, you had a recent blog post kind of talking a little bit about something which I think is relevant to this part of the conversation, which is, I'll paraphrase, and I don't remember the exact language you used, but this sort of balance between, I almost say for profit and not for profit, particularly in the sharing economy, right? Where this notion of, for example, to illustrate the point, I mentioned lots of people around here, they're out in their yard, they're doing work on their houses. I had this idea of having a tool library, right? Where I would just post and say, hey guys, I have a tile cutter and some hammers and some whatever. If you need to borrow them, come grab them. And by the way, I need a screwdriver, right? It's because we're all around and we're all here and we're all trying to get stuff done and we don't want to buy more stuff. On the other hand, I could probably go and rent that equipment. And so particularly for Trōv Mobility, we play in this space. Obviously, we're a commercial entity, right? So our job is to enable businesses to do the things that they need to do, particularly around mobility. But you have made the point that there is, and again, there's finer, more specific language, but there's a balance between the two. And I imagine that as we look forward and we think about perhaps redesigning a lot of different things, how do you think that plays into how things get redesigned, and why is it important?
Oh, such a good question. And it's like, I could talk about this all day. So
Okay.
I'll try. And already you can tell I have no problem talking and sharing my views. I'll try to keep it concise, but also I think it's intentionally provocative, because there's a lot of conversations that I think Trōv could be having, Trōv could be convening, Trōv could be catalyzing. And so, yeah, I wrote a piece. It's called Coronavirus, the End of the Sharing Economy or the Beginning, or a New Beginning. And this grows out of my role kind of at the 50-yard line of the sharing economy, looking at startups on the one hand, policy on the other hand, business models in the middle, and globally, how's it kind of playing out. And this is where it gets really interesting, that in my time as an advisor, really trying to suss out the opportunities for business in the sharing economy, the fact that we've built policy entirely from an ownership-based perspective, like we do not know how to regulate something that you share. Yeah. As Trōv has learned over the years, like it's really badly designed, it needs to be updated. But also, for the most part, by and large, we've actually kind of eliminated the role of community-based sharing, like a tool library, like you just described, which are awesome, right? I think every neighborhood should have one of those, because what we're doing, go back to the original intentions and ethos of the sharing economy, helping people save money, use resources more efficiently or sustainably, build community, and that's a key one, and also provide greater flexibility, convenience, etc. I think one of the fascinating stats back on tool libraries specifically, a power drill costs on average $100. A power drill is used on average 12 minutes in its entire life. So when you break it down like a per minute basis, that is an expensive power drill. And why does everyone need a power drill in their garage collecting dust, right? And so whether it's a power drill, then you think about your lawnmower or your snowblower or your ladder or like all of these things. But the key, and this is what I really want to hone in on when it comes to the sort of community-based, it brings people together. And this is where, so I've advised dozens of sharing economy companies who profess to be sharing economy. And they're all about, we're going to help people save money. We want to be good for the environment. Of course, we want to build community, but we're going to be, and practicality, convenience, and so forth. The community piece is the one that most platforms, not that they miss it, but when push comes to shove, if they have to prioritize making money versus building community, the community gets put under the bus quite quickly. And I want to be really clear, you know, one of my degrees is in international finance, economics. Like, I am not, there is a group of, or not a group, there are people around the world who believe that the moment, if you say sharing economy, and then you say but you have to pay money, that like, well, that's not sharing. The moment there's money, there's like no sharing. That I'm not of that camp. I am not saying that this can't be paying money to have exchanges where we're sharing assets of value. I fully get most people participate in the sharing economy. Their number one priority is actually the ability to save money or earn income from those activities. So that's really important. The kicker, the thing that has made me so frustrated over the years is that this notion of the value of community and relationships has been subsumed by this quest to make money, as opposed to looking at sharing economy platforms. And there are several out there where the only way that you can make money is if you're coming into community with other people. And I think, you know, a platform like Airbnb is a very good example. If you think about like home sharing, bona fide sharing economy, that's awesome. And you're meeting when you know the host, etc. Then you've got these sort of corporate short-term lets, which still are apparently sharing economy. In my book, they're not. But, you know, it's a very different kind of, it's transactional. It's not this social.
I'm going to interrupt you though for a second. I want to challenge you with something. So the question is, why is community so important? And because we all say community, community, community. You know, you got to be a good person. That's something that's easy to say. Community is important, but why is community important?
So I'm going to show a little bit, I don't want to say it's my bias, but, you know, as of looking to the future and looking to the past and looking at what we've gotten well and what we've gotten done poorly, I think, and I'll be a little provocative, but we live in a hyper consumerist society today. And even the word consumer, we call ourselves consumers as opposed to humans or guests or right? Yeah. What's interesting, we've consumerized almost every aspect of society, not just like cereal. We've consumerized elections, healthcare, education, entertainment. These are all consumer mass marketing exercises, right? Yet, before marketing ate the term, the word to consume meant to destroy, as in consumed by fire. So what I'm getting at here is, in our race to consume, and companies treating us more like consumers than like citizens. And citizens, I don't mean passports and border control. I mean citizens, members of a community. The more we're treated as consumers rather than citizens, the more we've lost track of what really matters. And what I'm looking at is, you know, in an ideal consumer world where you have all of your toys and I have all of my toys and I have my castle and you have your castle and we all have fences, what's the ultimate effect of that? Like, I don't need to know my neighbors. I don't want to know my neighbor. Like, wow, we've just snipped all of the relationships that are what actually has brought community together and what has helped humanity thrive over time. So I know I'm getting a little philosophical here, but
I agree with you, because what it builds is actually resilience, right? And it also one of our challenges with technology, I think, is it's encouraged us to go further afield, right? And so the shelter in place is, as I used the term earlier, sort of back to basics, fundamentals. It's brought us closer to home. There's more focus on local community. That has, for example, it has health benefits in the sense that when you're more focused on your neighbor across the street being okay, rather than hearing some terrible story about somebody else in the world, which you can't fix, you can't influence, you can't actually do anything with that, right? So from an empathy perspective, you know, it's quite hard to help somebody on the other side of the world if something bad is happening to them. Yet pre-COVID, certainly we're busy running out the door, and we don't notice that our elderly neighbor can't roll out their rolly bin to get picked up, the trash picked up. So there's that, but also, if you then, let's flip it to commercial operations and commercial businesses, that same weakness exists, right? So let's take Airbnb. If Airbnb disappears tomorrow, or we're seeing it in our space, there's weaknesses in businesses. These are global businesses. If they disappear, for example, there's no way to get from A to B anymore in the place that I live. My neighbor is now unemployed, right? Because of sort of this hyper global type of perspective instead of being more community focused. And I think so. I'm responsible for running a business. I'm also a human, but with my hat of running a business, I actually genuinely need to be thinking about that community aspect, that local aspect of it as well. Yeah,
exactly. And this is where I get so excited about the business opportunities that are out there. But what they require is for any business to truly walk the talk. And I think the best tagline that I have is, you need to treat your customers as citizens rather than consumers. Because when you treat them as consumers, it's like, just pay me money, just buy more stuff. You see them as, and with all due respect to consumer marketers, but like, why do we just bombard people with advertisements saying buy this, or you're not enough? And that's a lot of what you don't have enough, you don't have. Right.
Yeah, to simulate that
hamster wheel where we become disconnected from ourselves, but we become disconnected from our community. We become disconnected from the things that really matter. And if you look at this in terms of metrics around isolation, metrics around depression, metrics around anxiety, as well as people who simply, do you feel like you're living a fulfilled life? The human connection is the greatest driver of happiness and well-being that we have. You look at longitudinal studies. It's not about how much money you have. It's not about how many toys you have. It really, obviously, there are things like having a roof over your head and having enough to eat, key fundamentals. But when it comes to how we've looked at consumer marketing and consumer behavior today, there's a real clear disconnect between how people feel about themselves and their ability to reach their full potential. So back to the business piece. And I think, Airbnb, and then I'll give one example in the mobility space as well. So I've worked with Airbnb over the years, and I love parts of what they do, and I have a real hard time with other parts of what they do, right? But I mean, 90% of their business their business was so far down when the pandemic hit, right when they were planning to go public, which is fascinating. Listen to literally, it was 2 weeks before they were planning to file their S1. And now, we'll see. So here's the thing, Airbnb, they're having to go back to basics. And the CEO, Brian Chesky, he's given some wonderful interviews recently. But, one of the things he said is, what is the one thing that we provide that no one else does? And they were really a pioneer in home sharing, like bona fide home share. We can call it community-based, but, you meet your host, like what they did in the early days. They are going to double down on what really matters. And that is something that is truly valuable. And like even a public policy perspective, if you are hosting people in the same house in which you live, you're not disrupting local housing stock. Safety is typically not an issue, because if it's safe enough for you to sleep there, it's probably safe enough for guests. You get where I'm heading. That part of their business, I think, not only survives, but it thrives. Now, does that mean that Airbnb might be a bit smaller? Perhaps, because I think a lot of they were getting into hotels and much more of the transactional consumer facing sorts of things. I think that's going to be a very hard piece of their business moving forward, not only because of demand for travel being down, but also lots of competition. They're not the only ones doing that. And it's not really, when they say belong anywhere and they talk about the importance of community, what they mean is that original home sharing. They don't mean these, corporate landlords that never meet their guests. So if I'm Airbnb, now again, if you're, how do I say this? If all you're looking at is through how much money are they going to make, you may not be entirely happy. They will continue to make money. There's no question. But will they have hockey stick rates of return? Probably not. Now, again, as a looking back, looking forward, look at any system, kind of like any system that is designed to run faster. Ultimately, it collapses. any system that the expectation is hockey stick returns also collapses. You cannot maintain that sort of, like, look over time. You can't keep growing like that. Ultimately, you crater under your own weight. So I much prefer a sustainability curve that looks, like that, or even looks a little bit like that, but it's sustaining, and what you're helping people do is thrive within that community.
Yeah.
So that's Airbnb. I do want to mention, because it's one of my favorite, we might have talked about it in the past, but there is an international intercity ride sharing platform called BlaBlaCar.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'll just bring BlaBlaCar up here briefly, because so BlaBlaCar is an intercity ride-sharing platform that helps you fill your car with people traveling in the same direction. Basically, large, carpooling at scale, but across a large geography. It was founded in 2006 by a group of young people in France, who were fed up with how much waste that they saw in cars. Now, fast forward, today BlaBlaCar transports more than 4 times as many people as the entire European train network across 22 countries. They're in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. They're not here in North America. They're valued at about $2 billion. So their economic potential, like, they're doing fine. Here's the hook. Every single ride helps people save money, boost green transport, but builds community. You're sharing typically a multi-hour ride with other travelers. Drivers they don't earn an income. They're not quitting their jobs to become BlaBlaCar drivers. They need to go to the city anyway. Like, you don't travel from one city to another just for the heck of it. What they are doing is they're saving money, because the way that the BlaBlaCar model is calculated, if your car is full, the driver travels for free. So anyway, without going into too much detail, BlaBlaCar is the kind of company that sees its customers, sees its participants, sees its users as citizens. It's bringing them together, because what happens is, you share a ride with somebody for a few hours, you're going to get to know them.
Yeah.
They have had so many friendships forged, marriages, I mean, you name it, and it didn't cost anything. Here's the hook. It didn't cost anything extra, but it really did something for the community. So those are the kinds of businesses that I think will thrive. But any business that currently uses consumer marketing speak, I would strongly encourage you to review your use of the word consumer, and really think hard about, how do you see people who buy things from you? How do you treat your customers? Because chances are there are some very, in some ways easy, but really important changes that we're going to want and need to see moving forward.
Yeah, I even think, maybe just to tie it up on a bow, I think about the restaurants and the stores and the local businesses to me, who I think have benefited from serving the community, and they benefited in the sense that during this pandemic, people have been saying, go get your pizza from this place, they're doing takeout, go spend your money at these stores. So if we want to scale that up a bit, I think I would probably say that running a business, if you can factor community, if you can serve community better, actually what you'll get is resilience as a return.
Absolutely. If I can put just a very brief footnote on this, because it does run into a little bit of, I don't want to say tensions, but things that I think about a lot, which is, one of the hallmarks, things that I've talked about and so forth, and try to be a model for, is this notion of global citizenship. Right? That we are all interconnected and interdependent. And if you didn't think that before, just wait till a pandemic hits and you see how we are all in this together. Now, it affects us differently depending on where we live and so forth, and how old we are, but like, everyone is equally exposed in terms of just, it could show up in your community. But so this notion of, well, then should I just worry about, my concern is, if we all just go local, then we're not thinking about the person in India. We're not thinking about the person in South Africa. We're not, and I don't think that's where we want to head either. What I'm looking, again, going back to consumer versus citizen, for so long, we've wanted to build companies that have massive global scale. And that's not a bad thing per se. I see the value, and I see the efficiencies of that, but these are market efficiencies, which are not necessarily human efficiencies, so to speak. So I'm thinking about, imagine, to riff on what you were saying earlier, you can still build global companies, global, I think of them more as global networks of locally driven communities. So the way you get to global scale isn't through a single top-down structure of one company and one way of doing business and one hierarchy. It's actually much more through a distributed, decentralized network of local communities, each of which is really truly resilient. But then together we have far greater global resilience because someone over here isn't dependent upon something over there. And, you know, whether that's mobility, I mentioned earlier that I've been doing some work on the food system this year. And to understand the fragility of the global food system is really coming into stark view right now, partly because we've built this global system where we are exporting and importing stuff that you're growing in one country, you export, and yet you import that same ingredient from another country. It makes no sense. But that's what happens when you build from this consumer-driven top-down structure, as opposed to local resilience and from the ground up, but then linking those local food systems, in this case, to one another. It's fascinating. And what I love, again, it's totally doable. These are human-made problems. So we are going to have to, you know, we can come up with the human-made solutions. It's not like we need some piece of technology to drop from the sky. Going back to basics is actually easier than we might think when we realize how much we haven't been seeing. You know, I think so much of this is about how to see differently.
So we're almost out of time, and I think you've led us with a beautiful segue into your book, right? Your book. We need more tools to understand how to, I keep going to the word navigate it. It seems like that makes it sound easy, but tell us a little bit about the book and tell us about, you know, what value you hope that we get from it.
Thank you so much. So this is a delight. And it is, I'm writing my first book finally. People thought I should write a book 20 years ago, and they thought I should write a travel book because of all my travel. I just said, I love to travel, but I don't think the world needs another travel book. But the book is a lot about my experiences and exposures around the world specifically. And I love that you bring up, not quite navigating. There's navigating, but I look at this as, what is my book? It's the title is Flux Mindset, How to Thrive in Constant Change. So it's looking at this very much the things we've been talking about today. The new normal is constant change, relentless change perhaps, and yet most of the tools that we have to navigate change aren't working in today's world. And you know, with all due respect, I do a lot of work around business models and strategies and policies and so forth, and those really matter. But all of those things are actually driven by our mindset. Depending on the mindset that you bring to the table, you're going to think about strategy differently. You're going to think about policy differently. And so I'm really interested in, how do we need to update our mindset, our ways of thinking and being, in ways that are, you know, in many ways what I'm writing about, people would call it unconventional. They would call it, you know, that's not the way things are done. And I kind of come back and say, well, the way things have been done, it's not working, and it's not going to work moving forward. And so this, I won't go into too much detail in terms of, it's basically a flux mindset, so a world in flux. And I think the irony is I was working on this before the pandemic hit, right? But then the pandemic hit, and everyone's like, a world in flux? Yes, you know, this is my life, this is my reality. So it has been a great accelerant in that regard. But a flux mindset is basically a set of disciplines that we have to actually practice and train and groove our brains to think differently. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, so this isn't about getting into the hardwiring one's brain, but it does relate a lot to how we see, how we think, how we behave, how we interact with one another. And it's interesting because in this sort of Trojan horse way, I think, you know, what I was mentioning earlier about intention, what I was mentioning earlier about how we see, these are the kinds of things that show up in it. And, you know, this isn't a silver bullet. It's not a holy grail. It's a series of disciplines that we need to develop and improve over time. And we need to help our kids do it, and our parents and our colleagues. And really it's about, you know, how do we live better? How do we work better? And there is a big piece of this in terms of how do we lead? better.
Mm-hmm.
And not in terms of like leadership with the traditional CEO as a leader and everyone else follows. That's each and every one of us is a leader in our own right. So how do we lean in to change as opposed to fearing it or fleeing it or just letting it paralyze us?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, the book in a nutshell. It'll be out next year. So I'm still in the writing process, but thank you for asking. Yeah, and I think it's interesting with regards to insurance, even if we were to take the overlay of risk and how we think about risk and how we see risk, we start challenging some of that as well. And I think the pandemic has brought that into clear view, and how a flux mindset looks at risk is actually different than how I'll say consumer-based top-down hierarchical mindset, traditional change management mindset might look at it.
Well, great. I look forward to reading the book. April, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I feel like we probably need another hour to keep going to really drill into it, but I think it's been a fascinating conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to the next time we can see each other in person.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.